All right, service workers. They're great. They sit behind your browser and they do lots of things for you, and they're already kind of everywhere. So I bet you're wondering what a service worker could possibly be. That's what my next card's about. It's a type of web worker, which means that your browser launches an asynchronous JavaScript process that is not attached to your tab. What it does is it takes control of requests from tabs, if you set it up to do that, based on a scope. The scope is generally where the JavaScript file for the service worker lives, and anything that is at that level or below that on the directory structure. The further down a service worker is, i.e. the more specific that it is, that's how it takes control of a tab in. It will take control of a tab that is on a page if it is more specific than another service worker that could also be taking that page. It's useful because you're able to intercept fetch requests and annotate them out to a CDN or something, or even return static content that you've preloaded. So if somebody's offline, they can still get around your website with pre-cached assets. The life cycle of a service worker is this. You install service worker. If you set it up to, it will start running and activate on that run. Otherwise, it will wait for another tab to go to a page that is within its scope before it starts running again. It'll listen for once a tab goes to a page that it controls, it will activate. You can have it do a bunch of things on activation. Generally, I just log out that it's activated to make sure that it's working for debugging purposes. Then you can intercept fetch requests, message requests, which are I guess it's a way to communicate with your service worker from a tab. They're not terribly useful. Sync requests, which allow you to sync data from your front end to the service worker so that if you're offline, the service worker will be able to wait until later to push all of that data up somewhere. And push requests, where if you register your service worker, you can take a push request as if it was a mobile app. Today we're going to focus on fetch requests because service workers are somewhat complicated and fetch requests are the easiest thing to show their benefit for. So in order to intercept a fetch request on the front end, you have to actually register a service worker. Support for service workers is in most browsers except for Safari and a couple of other ones with mobile, but in general they're fairly well supported. So you do need to check to see if they're in your navigator. Once they are inside the service worker, you have to listen for a fetch event and then grab that. If you grab that event and decide to respond with something, you have to give it a promise. And in the end of that promise, you're going to be returning it what either looks like the request itself or a promise of that fetch. So if you're going for a file, you can store the response to that file or a response that you prefer for that file inside of a series of caches that the service worker has access to and return that, or you could just return whatever you get from the request. And I'll show you a couple of things that you can do with it. So this first example right here is an example of annotating a request URL so that it responds with an optimized image. Inside of a service worker, you can see what kind of connection the user has. If they're on a cellular device, I have it here saying anytime you see a JPEG, add optimize phone true to the end of it. if it's not on cellular and they're not an image, it'll just go through regularly, and I won't have intercepted anything. So it doesn't break much. One thing to watch out for with service workers is if you make a fetch to general, and you can wind up breaking absolutely everything on your site. And browsers will take 24 hours in between updating your service worker file. Also, if you tell it to intercept the updating of your service worker file, it will explode and never update. So it's one of those great power, great responsibility things. The second example, though, is for serving from an offline cache. So with this one, what happens is it fetches the request and then stores it in the cache. However, if the fetch fails, it will then resort to the cache and say, hey, did I store this already? And if it did, return that instead. So you'll be able to go back to pages that you've already loaded because you've already got the responses stored in your cache. This works really well for SPAs because it can intercept API recalls and store those API calls via each request, which includes params and stuff. So it's pretty useful for homepage apps and just kind of extending a website so that on a mobile device or on a computer you don't just drop out if their internet service is a little bit slow or buggy. It's very useful like this. There's existing ones that will convert BPG files into JPEGs and PNGs, which allow you to reduce your overhead of loading images by about 40%, which is pretty good. But is it ready for every website? Not particularly. IE doesn't support it, Edge doesn't support it, Safari doesn't support it. But Chrome and Android browsers do, as well as Firefox and Opera, which means a lot of big people are out there and they're already using it. Chrome uses it, lots of blogs use it. If you ever want to check out all the ones that are installed, because you don't have to approve the installation of a service worker, they're just there. You can check out Chrome service worker internals. You'll probably have like 50 because they're just sitting there waiting for you to go back to those websites. And a particularly interesting use of a service worker is the Sandro Paginati BPG converter. That will reduce your loading bandwidth by about 40% if you're running on Chrome, Firefox, or Opera, and you have your images set up properly for it. So that's kind of my quick talk on service workers.